Hello everyone, welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone, I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now Nick, I was just describing for you a little bit because I know our audience loves to hear sort of these stories about our lives, and I was explaining my uni ball coaching, and over the weekend we had quite a impressive performance, setting career highs for the team over the 8 years I've been coaching. But I've got a uni ball kid that is benching 180 kilograms, which I think is close to 400 pounds, some ridiculous number. And I've affectionately dubbed him as the next Eddie Lacy because he's quite a big guy. He's got the dreads. He's got the kind of thick barrel body. If anyone that knows the NFL knows Eddie Lacy will recognize that body type. And we just ran our way into the playoffs, Nick. I'm not Pep Guardiola. I'm more of a Big Sam kind of guy, to put it in terms of maybe our English fans would understand if they don't understand what the flex bone, the triple option is. But Nick, it was a great weekend of football for me. If you can't tell, I'm a little raspy, did a lot of yelling. Exciting times in the world of Division II uni ball football in Great Britain.
Are you yelling because you're excited, yelling at your players to do better, yelling at the refs? Who are you, diverting most energy towards?
Well, Nick, I actually feel a bit bad because we did the podcast the other week where I said I refereed for the first time. And, I talked about how I thought it opened up a new world of perspective for me. It didn't last long.
Oh, well, I mean, that's part of the fun. Once you're in that coach's seat, I always found when I did coaching that I took it way more, to heart, everything that happens on the field than I did when I was playing myself. And I don't really understand the why there, but it's like you just take the extra responsibility of everyone on the field is an extension of you, and what happens on there is so much more personal. It's like it's family. I don't know. I found it very unique. I couldn't believe when I was coaching, why am I getting so angry and yelling at everyone all of a sudden? It was quite surreal.
Yeah, I don't know if it's as a coach, as a player, you feel like you can impact the game. If someone does something, you can go out on the next play and, try to redeem yourself or do something. Whereas a coach, maybe there's a degree of helplessness where you feel like you can impact the game as a coach and players and tactics, but it's not the same as a player, being able out to go correct. I don't know, Nick, but certainly I feel, I'm definitely a little bit more emotional as a coach than a player.
Big question for you here. What's your thoughts on coaches and having to have played the sport at a certain level? Because that's a big contentious issue. Like there's been some successful coaches over the years that have never played pro, never even played semi-pro in various different sports. It could be football, soccer, it could be the NFL, it could be basketball, it could be any array of sports. What's your view on the level you need to have played at to be able to step on and be a successful coach?
I don't think it matters, in my experience with players, is at the end of the day, if they believe that you're going to help them achieve their goals, then it's okay. I think the biggest thing I've experienced is if they come to you with a question and either A, you can't answer it, or you give an answer that, to be honest with you, feels like isn't genuine, or they can tell isn't a good answer, then they lose the respect. So long as you have their respect, they'll take it. Because over here in GB, there's a lot of guys that haven't played at a certain level, but you can tell when a coach. Sometimes it's okay to admit you don't know something and you'll come back with an answer. But as soon as you lose a player's trust, it's tough. But, I think there's definitely examples. You think, who's the guy down in Miami that always looks like a bit of a Colombian drug lord? How have I forgotten his name?
I can see him now standing on the dais. He's always coming up with some quick comments, and he's got these fancy sunnies on.
But he never played at a particularly high level, and I think he's fine. Or even someone like Sean McVay, I think only played D3 university football. I think it's one of those things you don't have to be, but you have to be a genuine person, because those are some impressive individuals.
Well, those two you've described, though, I think are great examples of coaches that they were super young when they've taken on that responsibility, so that other people have seen something truly special in them. And they've come with a very different and unique approach to pretty much anyone else in the league, which is one of those things that I guess, what we talk about a lot is disruption and change in industries, and coaching is an industry in itself. And they've clearly found a way to go in with a confidence, which I think is amazing. In your early 30s and you're coaching guys that are older than you, and then having the wherewithal to take in and instill a different approach to how they're used to doing things. Like there's only been one way. I have to run this play this certain way. Well, actually, no, you don't anymore. I think it's just there's something special about those people. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll take this, transition into going into football itself, but talking specifically about the NFL now. Granted, it was a week past, and we didn't get the chance to necessarily go through it, but we always talk about sort of the storylines. It's always kind of a big litmus test to sort of see where the NFL is at in terms of viewership. And this year, just based on some statistics, I'll rattle off. It had a peak viewership of 137.7 million people, took place during the second quarter. On average, it had 127.7 million people, which was a 3% increase from last year. One of the other interesting points, and something you spoke a little bit about on LinkedIn, Nick, was that approximately 14.5 million people streamed the game, with 13.6 million using Tubi, sort of being a significant rise in digital viewership. And there were some other interesting statistics as well. Just kind of, they were just shy of 2 million people watching on Telemundo, Fox Deportes in Spanish. And even in the UK, it had 3.4 million unique viewers, which was a 48% increase from last year. So not only are the numbers going up in the US, which is tough to do because of how popular it already is, but starting to see it in other marketplaces grow. So, Nick, lots of statistics, lots of numbers being thrown around. There's some nuances in there, particularly from the streaming side. What's your takeaway, whether the NFL should be happy or what we should take away from the viewership numbers this year?
Yeah, I mean, the NFL will no doubt make a big deal about the fact there's growth, as will all the broadcasters as well. We're just getting into this tricky moment in the industry where for a while we've been trying to work out how streaming is compared to linear and OTA measures. And now we've finally come to a point where we're almost there, where we're comparing them apples with apples, I suppose, in terms of their numbers, which is great. But we don't know yet if they are actually apples with apples. You are getting more and more breakdowns of the streaming numbers, so average minute audience and so forth, which is going more and more comparing with some of the ratings numbers you see. But the ratings modeling that Nielsen's been operating for some time isn't by any stretch empirical. There is lots of people who question the approach they've run over the years. So I'm not too I know they've made some changes to that to try and improve it, but they've still taken very incremental steps to finally get where we've got to. And the way I look at it now in terms of those numbers is, yes, there's an overall number increase. But is that really the measure of success for everyone involved? And it could well be the case. One of the things that we've got dropping in next week's pod is we're talking a lot about advertising revenue. And that's ultimately why some of the biggest broadcasts in the US bid for those rights to have the Super Bowl on the platform, as they sell the Super Bowl ads at incredible revenues. And if they can extend that audience through streaming and digital, that audience grows in scale, they can start continuing to drive more and more revenue. And the benefit of streaming can be, if that number scales further and further, more than the 10% or 12% that it was this year, is that they can also get much more personalized, contextualized with the marketing. So all of a sudden, you won't just see those Super Bowl ads in many years from now, perhaps being uniform as the ad that ran at that same slot for everyone. It could be that the linear broadcast has that, but actually the stream product might have a different experience altogether. So my overall view is I question whether these numbers confirm that the sport is more popular than it was previously. It might be, but my concern is that we could just keep seeing the broadcasters adding more avenues to distribute the games and the Super Bowl itself. For example, I've suggested, I think it's only a few years until we'll see YouTube have a live stream available, whether it be, let's say, in Fox's own channels or through the YouTube TV. I don't know, but they'll keep opening it up to more and more ways to get it out there. And so those numbers might look and sound great, but actually they're having to do a lot more work, distribute a lot more places to keep that going, rather than just maintain the ratings as is, following the traditional models that it's led with. So I think they're positive. I think they're in a good position. I just think there's some grey there that I'd love to get clarity on, whether it is, no, this is empirically a massive win, or it's not. If you're sitting where I am, I'm not quite sure it is.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things for me. One of them is, I've always wondered how they come up with that number, in the sense of the Super Bowl is a social event. I don't know many people that probably watch the Super Bowl in isolation. So how do you come up with that number when I assume the overwhelming majority got to be like over 95% of people will have watched in parties or in groups? So I've always been curious to know, like, how do you actually come up with that number? Because I just don't know anyone that watches the Super Bowl unless they're sick or there's an unfortunate family situation, something like that, who actually watch. So like, I've always been curious to know how they come up with that number. Maybe you know the answer, Nick. I don't know.
I know. I do. I think they do some modeling on it. I'm not exactly sure. I've looked it up before, but I have not looked at it for some time. I do remember though when I was publishing a magazine. I worked in newspapers and magazine distribution and circulation over my years. There will be some random numbers that you get told to use to justify the difference between a circulation and a readership. And basically, circulation is how many copies are sent out, and readership is how many people have read that copy. And some magazines would tell you, oh, on average, one copy is read 3.9 times per copy. And you're like, is that actually true? So I think there's always a question to some of the logistics or the measures of how these things are put out there. I'm not exactly sure on that. I think it's a great question because no doubt everyone is watching it. So something we should probably look into next time is to work out how they actually publish those numbers and if they're using a uniform measure to traditional ratings. Because to your point, if they are, that feels a little bit flawed.
Yeah. Well, if someone does know the answer, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or email. But then the other question I sort of have off the back of this, Nick, and I think it is probably a question I'm going to ask about the NFL, but the Premier League is probably dealing with it in the UK. The Bundesliga is probably dealing with it in Germany. You talk about growth of popularity in the US, but like how much more room is there to get more popular? Same thing with the Premier League in the UK, stuff like that. You know, you want to see growth, but at some point there is a limited number of people that live in the US. Like, should we expect this number to go up every single year, or is it really more a matter of we just don't want to see it drop too far? Like, I just don't know how much more the number can go up.
Well, the tricky bit is I'm not sure the media industry they don't like to deal with negative narratives. And so they would rather, that's why I think they'll play, you'll see it go on YouTube in a couple of years from now because they'll be like, we can't let these numbers go down. So instead, let's just get it out to more places, celebrate that we've got more audiences, even if we're not building our audiences on our platforms. Now, one of the wins for Fox here is their Tubi platform is advertising led. They're able to get a huge amount of people onto the platform for likely the first time. That's a massive win of audience acquisition that I'm sure they're super pumped about on top of the ratings. That's a massive, massive win. That won't happen every time unless they keep launching new platforms. So they keep having to try and find ways to drive extra value outside of the traditional ratings numbers and just selling it for pure ad revenue. So to your point of our popularity and growth, yeah, my thing is basically you'll see it across sports and you see it across media constantly. They'll do whatever they can to allude to, present numbers that they're growing and everything's hunky-dory or going in the right direction. They'll do whatever they can to avoid it. You've even seen, we've not been in the rooms for those negotiations, but you think about the Premier League and some of the deals they've done, they make a big song and dance about the fact their total revenue might be going up from a per games basis. But we all know in the industry, hey, the total revenue might be going up, but you're giving away way more value to the broadcaster now. Maybe that's fine. It's not an issue, but we keep trying to tell ourselves our own, I don't know, mislead ourselves almost as an industry. And maybe that works in some instances, but I do think I'm a bit skeptical about that. One thing that you mentioned though on the ratings front though, that I don't want to make sure we don't miss out on is a 48% increase in the UK that's enormous. It's not a new proposition, the Super Bowl in the UK. So I do wonder where that growth has come from. Is it in something that they've done, whether it be that the NFL's UK stuff has hit in a different way this year, or Sky's doubled down on it better than they have before, giving it more visibility? That's a huge increase at that sort of level.
Yeah, or it's just one of those long-term, they've been doing the international games for a while, but that's not going to be an instant thing. That takes time. Is this, potentially you reap what you sow, and, you've spent, I think their first game in the UK was 2007, 2008. And, maybe this is starting to see a little bit of that. I don't know, but I agree with you. When we talk about the popularity, that is something that's where you can potentially grow, not necessarily. But the other thing I want to talk about, Nick, and you kind of previewed it a little bit, was talking about Tubi, and we're going to spend the podcast next week talking explicitly about advertising models. On that one, you talked about it's really good for Fox because it is driving value towards that, and it's not something you're going to be able to replicate every year. It's a new platform. But is there any takeaway you have from that in terms of just that particular platform, that particular model for monetizing, and what that means for the industry wider?
Well, just that what I think has gone a little bit under the radar, at least in terms of for those who aren't in the core of the, say, streaming space, is firstly, Tubi is an ad-funded platform. Most of the other major platforms in the market are typically subscription-funded. Most of us now are very much waxing lyrical, at least we are, about the importance of advertising as a primary funding model for sports and sports rights. So the fact that this platform has worked so well, there's been next to no news about the huge increase in audience and bandwidth being an issue for them to deliver. In fact, their latency numbers were, I think, the lowest out of everything that was broadcast, which is an incredible achievement. So for me, it's a pretty major success story for a platform to be able to all of a sudden ingest record numbers on the platform, deliver it what seems to be pretty seamlessly, and really sort of solidify Tubi's place in that market as a legitimate platform for people to look at for consumption moving forward. So a huge win for Fox in that instance. And you remember, like, Fox hasn't been in the streaming game really, not following the same approach as most of its competitors. They've waited longer than anyone else, acquired Tubi, taking a slightly different approach. And it really seems to be paying off now. And this patience that they've taken means they haven't hemorrhaged a lot of money like the rest of them. And they're now pretty well set up to make the most of this platform that's been able to achieve and deliver a really high quality product.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of StreamTime Sports. This episode is brought to you by our partners at Kanto. Content is the MVP of the sports world. Whether it's engaging fans, building brands, or driving revenue, it's a game changer. But keeping up with the demands of instant platform-ready content, that's a tough play. Enter Kanto. Kanto's industry-leading digital asset management platform calms the chaos of managing sports content. From AI-powered searching of matchday photos and rapid creation of B-roll videos for social media, to giving sponsors, players, and agents quick, easy access to branded assets, Kanto keeps your team focused on the action. Just ask Maserati Racing, NASCAR, or British Fencing. They've streamlined workflows, boosted fan engagement, and strengthened sponsored relationships with Kanto in their corner. Ready to level up your content game? Visit Kanto.com today. Now, one of the things that we are going to talk about in a few different stories, it seems like over the last 2 weeks that there's been a lot of news all surrounding ESPN, going from different packages they're going to offer, new markets that they're entering, sports rights that they may or may not decide to renew. So there's quite a few things here on ESPN. And I think one of the reasons worth focusing on ESPN is, similar to the NFL, they are a big leader in the sports space. And if they do things, it kind of reverberates across the market. But the first one, Nick, and I think we didn't actually get a chance to talk to you because you were still in Australia and moving back over to Sweden. Off the back of the Venue Sports sort of collapsing and, the big win for Fubo, one of the things that's come from ESPN is that they're talking about Disney offering ESPN in skinnier bundles. And this seems to be a direct response to the collapse of Venue, I don't know how you want to call merger, acquisition, Fubo, however we want to define that. But maybe, Nick, this is a good time now that Bob Iger's come out and talked about this, a chance for you to get to have your say on the finale of it, because I don't think you got to do it. I think it was just Steve and I. And then sort of kind of what you think about this general statement from ESPN offering within the Disney Plus package.
Yeah, I think we might find it a little bit harder to get our hands onto David Gandler on the pod, but we'll definitely try and get him back on at some stage. He's been a good guest of ours over the years, and it's a huge validation for all the things that he's been talking about in the media with us and with other media outlets for some time. So that is a huge achievement, and I'm very interested to see what does play out there. But I mean, there was even comments a couple of years ago that David was going to be someone that could vie for Bob's job, or at least a senior role in the Disney business at some time. So I'm very interested to see how that does evolve, and also what happens with that case, because there is speculation that other platforms may want to pick up the mantle, or pick up the baton, I should say, for Fubo to go after this issue. And that's one of the reasons they basically had to shut down the Venue Sports platform altogether. So now this whole notion of skinny bundles is here, and it's being talked about. The bundle has been something it's been talked about at length. And ultimately, I think what it comes down to is a very simple thing. Consumers they need very simple messaging about what they're getting access to. We come to a time, I think, where throwing the kitchen sink at people for a lot of money in terms of the legacy of the cable model does not whet the appetites of consumers like it used to. They just like to know what they are paying for, and that consumers need choice. So the skinny bundle concept allows basically these platforms to make sure they provide something that goes direct to consumer with the best margins possible, and it's a very simple message for them to market and sell to their audiences, which is great. But they still have to make sure that they are taking that really broad distribution approach and being in as many places as possible. So you're just going to continue to see this really complex web of deals between different streaming platforms and companies that I struggle to keep track of, where there's minimum guarantees going in different directions, there's revenue shares going in different places, all sorts of stuff going on. And ultimately, we have to just continue as an industry, and particularly streaming platforms, have to continue to be really smart about how they market all these products to people, because it gets really confusing. And if consumers get confused in this day and age, they just go to the next product, the next shiny thing, because that's the way we work, right? So if it's too hard, they'll move on. So they have to be really thoughtful about these things moving forward. But I think you just can see more creative ways of getting the customer on your platforms, because ultimately we have seen that the churn rates are pretty low on these platforms. While you do get them on, there is some movement. So getting them on at all prices, at all costs, is basically the name of the game.
Yeah, well, in terms of that bundle, what they're talking about or potential option, it seems that they're also now going to be expanding their offer in Australia and New Zealand. So we're going back to your hometown, and it seems like, Nick, we've had quite a few stories about Australia, lots of movement going on in the media space there. But Disney has announced integration of ESPN into their sports programming within the Disney Plus streaming services available in the two marketplaces out in New Zealand and Australia. So Nick, there's some different things about pricing. It seems quite expensive, but I'm pretty sure the way Australia is and where the dollar is, your prices typically tend to be higher than ours. But by the time you convert, so I know $210 a month sounds really crazy for maybe the Americans, but I think that's a bit more of a standard price in Australia. But again, Nick, we've seen a lot of movement with DAZN and Foxtel, and there's been some other news about other potential mergers and acquisitions in Australia. Now there's this news around ESPN being offered as a part of Disney Plus. What do you take from all the different movements going on in Australia right now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation, I think, in Australia, and it quite often goes under the radar of the international sports media landscape, because it's Australia. It's a 25 million population marketplace that it's working in, give or take a couple million, but it's super competitive, super mature, but it's actually not as fragmented as, let's say, the US or even in the UK perhaps as well. So the reason those cost points are so high is because Foxtel in particular has a really expensive Foxtel has a really expensive product, but they have a good chunk of all the bulk rights. And Disney Plus is a really robust offering for a market that doesn't have as many competitors in it from a streaming perspective. But at a free-to-air perspective, there's a huge amount of competition. For context, though, on the price point, you can basically halve it for pounds to Aussie dollars. I think that works out. So if it's $210, that's about £105. That's about 130, 140 US dollars. So still, super expensive. But if you work it out, what's that work out to 140 US dollars? That's it's about 12 US dollars a month. That feels about right. Yeah. When it's annualized, it looks like a bigger number and commitment. But yeah. So where to start? I'd say that the market's been so competitive and so at each other's throats for so long because of the value of sports in the country. Like Australia definitely rivals the US in terms of its love of live sports rights, but you have that extra complexity. And it differs to the US, where there is a certain chunk of all the major leagues, the major Australian leagues, have to be available through free-to-air channels, and they are hugely, have huge ratings. It's on Channel 9, Channel 10, Channel 7. Now, when I was in Australia in January, there was cricket on basically all day and night long on the main commercial network. So think about that from, say, the US perspective, or even, let's say, the UK, which are our main ones we talk about, obviously, because of the English speaking part. Think about one single sport being on from 9 in the morning till 9 p.m. at night, 10 p.m. at night. That's it. That's all they have. And they have half an hour news slot in the middle. That's basically what they're broadcasting, and that's on free to air. So you have a lot of a lot of competition for those premium rights and a lot of loss of revenue, a loss of profits over the last few years as Paramount's launched into the market. DAZN's been around the edges of it, now making a big splash with their investment in Foxtel. I think it's just come to a point now that with the challenges of driving growth in media businesses, the market's having to consolidate now and breathe a little bit easier. But this particular story, it's significant on a global scale because Disney's now really bringing their ESPN product into a local market proposition. I think that's pretty significant because we only had one other instance of Disney doing that I had seen, and that was when they acquired the Conference League and Europa League rights to the UEFA competitions. So that's basically the second and third tier underneath the Champions League in Europe. They secured that in Denmark and Sweden. Now, I did hear some reasons that was particularly a unique situation behind the scenes as to why that happened. But my point is they haven't done a lot of this before. And to bring a channel, a brand into the Disney ecosystem does feel like a pretty significant extension of what they are offering. Now, if you go on a Disney Plus platform, there is a whole bunch of different titles available under the brand, but sports just hits differently, right? It has a different level of importance and value. So I think it's significant if we're going to start to see this expanding further and further. I could keep going on this, but basically, in short, it all depends on where ESPN's visible as well. They don't have ESPN in all the major markets; they only have it in a handful, which means, we'll have to wait and see what else they do with it from here.
Yeah, to your point, it's interesting because of what it could mean. This is an example of what we'll see in other markets because obviously ESPN over the last 12 months have been very vocal about launching a D2C platform. So is this the manner in which they're going to do it? And I think the interesting bit when you talk about the price point, and this is always, I think something that's come up quite a bit is, think of the average person, they're married, kids, you only have so much money. Well, I could have the skinny sports package, but that's not going to keep my 5-year-old entertained. But if I do the Disney Plus package, I can have all the Disney channels and I can have the sports channels. It just kind of gets into that whole budgeting psychology of, what am I going to do? Like maybe I don't get all the sports I get in my skinny sports package, but I'm at least getting something to keep my kids entertained. And when I've got to justify the cost of that subscription, like it's not just about the sports only. I mean, there's probably only a small minority of people that are actually in the position to say, hey, I exclusively just only want to watch sports. Like there's so many other people that have to take other considerations.
Well, that's the thing with Disney. I think, and I've just posted something on LinkedIn about this, but I haven't really even scratched the surface on this. Remember, Disney has so many different brands underneath that. Like, when I think of Disney, I just think of the cartoons, the family style content. But then you start looking about all the different brands that sit underneath the Disney ecosystem, part of the Walt Disney business. There's a huge amount. You've got Star Wars also sit underneath that. You've got Simpsons and other big, interesting brands on there. So there is a lot of
the whole Avengers, the whole Marvel universe is there.
Exactly. So there's all this other stuff on there. And so I just wonder where the future of the sort of Disney brand does go. Does it, in everyone's eyes, I think if you would talk to an adult now, you would say, what is Disney to you? And they would have a similar position of what it stands for, and even the Disney World and places that it's all built around that family related type environment. But now with what they're doing with Disney Plus and having this home for all of this different type of content that is not targeted to the same demographics, becoming a one-stop shop destination. I just wonder how much of that is going to change over the coming years and how quickly that will change. Because in my view, it will have an impact to the brand over time. And that may not matter. That may be what they want. They might be absolutely great and akin to what Netflix is today. Are we going to go on Netflix now to watch content? The Disney brand might just become that if they get the positioning right. But I just wonder if that has a knock-on effect to the other stuff that they do and they're so well renowned for today. But I think your points are super valid. That's one of the reasons that Disney are taking this approach is they want to be everything to everyone, as do really, there's only a few platforms can do it. And Netflix is one of them, and Disney's probably definitely close second. And that's why they've been quite successful in their launch.
Sports Pro is heading to New York this March for 2 game-changing events, Sports Pro New York and Sports Pro AI USA, taking place in Manhattan on March 20th and 21st. For a limited time, we are giving our podcast listeners an exclusive $500 discount on our co-located pass. Simply use the code POD500 at checkout. Don't miss this chance to connect with industry leaders, explore the future of sports business and AI, and gain insights from top executives, all under one roof. Spots are filling fast, so grab your pass today and we'll see you in New York. Well, damn, Nick, what a transition that is, because we're just about to talk about Netflix, and it does stick with the ESPN theme though, but Netflix is a part of it, and it's interesting for me, Nick, because when I first joined the business, 5.5 years ago, we had the fan conference, and that took place in my first couple of weeks of the business. We hosted it at the Tottenham Stadium at the time, and we had Ian Holmes, who we separately interviewed later on early in the Stream Time days, and that was just when Drive to Survive was coming out, and there was all that positive momentum. And part of that positive momentum was its growth in popularity in the US, which was partially driven by the fact that it had been picked up by ESPN and that Drive to Survive all came out. And we talked quite a bit. Like at the time, ESPN got an absolute bargain for the deal. Like they weren't actually paying that much for it. But that deal does end at the end of this year. And we've seen Netflix expanding its reach, showing more ambition than it has before. And it seems as though there's smoke that, Netflix is interested. Now, I think it makes sense why Netflix is interested in the sense of Formula One being kind of event-based, big tentpole moments that you can drive around. But then the other question I think is interesting is we've always asked, how popular can Formula One get? And I think there's no doubt it's gotten popular, but obviously they'll be going in asking for a much bigger price point than what they did before. Have they gotten as popular as they think they might want to be to drive that price, where ESPN is going to question that? Because it feels like if it was that popular, ESPN's just not going to let Netflix, we'll think about it in NFL football terms. I'm a Bengals fan. We're not even going to let T. Higgins get to free agency, because if he gets to free agency, he's never coming back. It's the same thing. Like, does ESPN want to lock that down before it goes out? Or has it maybe not grown as popular as it is going to justify that cost? Or is Netflix going to get another great property?
Lots of questions, and I'll have lots of questions as well in where this goes and how significant it is. I do think a couple of things. Let's look at Netflix to begin with. One of the things I think one of the co-CEOs, I don't know which one's which, but one of them basically came out and did say, hey, we want event-based, and it's clear from their actions they want event-based rights. They don't just want necessarily, they're not prioritizing, they may down the line. They want event-based stuff, but basically obviously is really valuable in driving subscribers, driving inertia to audiences, whether it be acquisition of new or just providing extra value to existing subscribers. But they are very much focused on event-based. And I do think F1 is sitting in that nice blurry spot in the middle where it's events-based enough to tick that box for them if they want to have a year round. And they've shown with their deal with the WWE that kind of works for them, that once a week type approach. Well, NFL, the F1 approach is pretty close to that. So it does fit that criteria pretty well. And then you see what they've done with Drive to Survive. I remember when we did speak to Ian Holmes at the time, and I've also spoken to Paul Martin from Box to Box when I did the interview with him at the fan conference, actually, at the time, who's the I think he's co-founder and executive producer at Box to Box, who runs most of those major documentary series. And now it was initially a lot of praise on the Box to Box, and then F1 wanted to take some praise and take on that sort of mantle that they had come up with this amazing idea that had worked. And now I think we're at a point where we're not really sure where they go with Drive to Survive. Does it keep just ticking over and doing the same thing because it has this base and core rate of audience with some subtle innovations? But it still did really well last year. The challenge they've got, so Netflix, I think, basically, in short, I agree, there's a good case for it here. Now, I think there's two layers to this. One is the US approach. Do they go for it in America and America alone, therefore competing just with ESPN for these rights? Or do they try and take some sort of global approach? And my view on that would be, if the global approach is possible, it would mean that the F1 TV platform, the OTT product, would basically become part of a deal to be ingested into the Netflix proposition in some way, shape, or form. And that would give them a bulk of rights, a bit like what we saw with DAZN in the NFL Game Pass approach. And they would bring that into the business, and then therefore they would have a global offering and would allow them to really, really and truly leverage that events-based global reach that F1 has. Think about all the opportunities they have to market. They could almost have their own roadshow of marketing to drive audience acquisition from race to race, with Netflix visible and front and center at all those major circuits in the coverage, at least anyway. On the US front alone, it's really interesting because we've seen with ESPN that, and the Disney business more widely, if they value something, they will bid for it, and they will probably win it. They'll find a good medium to get there, and their success last time, we've talked about a number of times over the years, is that Amazon were apparently the ones vying for it before and missed out because, well, one of the speculations was that they didn't have enough shoulder programming or keeping F1 in the story, in the headlines as much as ESPN could. But the ratings have flattened quite a lot. They have not had a good couple of years on the ratings front in terms of the growth you would probably have expected or hoped for. And that is probably simply down to the lack of competition at the racing level, which has started to improve last year. So they need to get that competitive balance again to see if that can drive the ratings boost that they need. And if they find that, then I think then they're going to have something that's going to drive ratings up and up again. But I'm not sure where it's going to go. I think ESPN might say, if they want it, they'll bid for it, and there'll become a really interesting bidding war between Netflix and ESPN. My gut feel is Netflix might usurp them if they're not happy with the flattening of ratings that they might have been expecting.
Yeah, I agree pretty much on all your points there, whether they take the global or the nation by nation approach. What would be interesting that you talked about, though, was the potential inclusion. Like, we've seen there will be people that complain because people always complain. I feel like DAZN have done a pretty decent job of incorporating NFL Game Pass into their platform. Is a perfect no, but like, you know, you're picking at little things there. It would be interesting because I'm not really aware of. Well, I take that back. Steve McCaskill maybe should be the person I ask about how he feels about WWE's incorporation, because obviously WWE had their own platform for a very long time. They pulled that back when it went to Peacock, but now it's within Netflix. So maybe I'll ask Steve how he's found that, because I won't have personally experienced anything on Netflix in terms of kind of acquiring someone else's platform. Because as you say, not everyone's going to even be aware of the Formula One, Formula One Pro? Was that the name of the package? If that would become a part of Netflix and how that would exist within the platform.
Yeah, I think it's F1 TV Pro is the full blown access to the live broadcast. One thing that was interesting in the ESPN relationship, I believe, is still the case. And so again, if anyone's listening can correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't watched it in the US for a long time, but I believe they still take the Sky Sports broadcast, the Sky Sports feed and production. Effectively, they're paying for that service from Sky Sports. So that's another little layer to think about here. It could be, for example, that F1 might take on that responsibility in a similar way to, let's say, that the MLS had to, even if they do use a third party like an IMG Productions or an EP to do it, and then broadcast that and give the feed of that content out to the masses rather than having Sky's broadcast team do the bulk of the work there. That's just another wrinkle on top of this, because I do think if you want it to be something that they want to lean to in a global perspective, Netflix might want the ability to overlay of a lot of different languages and commentary over the top of it easily. They'll just want to be able to put their own shape on it, I think. So that could be another question mark to see in what does happen with these set of rights, because it is a really important moment, I think, for F1. F1 has been so focused on growing in the US ultimately with the the moves with the Las Vegas race and the Miami investments and etc. they've done there, and they want to make this big entertainment proposition. And because of this flattening of ratings that we have seen in some of the races, they need to make sure they can solve that and keep that growth momentum, because otherwise all the other numbers are looking pretty good. Financially, they're in a really good place. They're driving more revenue. The bottom line's looking healthier. Yeah, they just need to make sure they can bring back some of that competitive edge and really make sure that this season is a real competition right to the final race.
Yeah. Well, again, their current deal ends at the end of 2025, so it is something we'll follow across the calendar year. Another one, though, that has a little bit more of an urgent timeline, and again, once again involves ESPN as the course of this discussion, is Major League Baseball. Their original contract was signed in 2021, but there apparently was a break clause for both parties, which could take place, if agreed upon, by March of this year in 2025, which would impact the 2026 through 2028 seasons. I suppose the interesting thing for me, Nick, is that we had talked about quite a bit after the NBA's deal was done, that we kind of assumed most of the major U.S. sports rights were locked up. The NFL was in the midst of its 10-year deals. The NBA is just locked up. MLS is locked up with Apple. The assumption was Major League Baseball was locked down. And we sort of thought it might be a bit of a quiet period. Now, we know people like the NFL will always find new ways to carve out new rights, things like that. But for something like Major League Baseball, granted, I know they have struggled a bit. Now they've done some different things to try to get some of the ratings back, and it seemed like last year was a bit of a bounce back for them. But they're definitely not held on the same level as the NFL or the NBA. But I think one thing Major League Baseball has going for it, it's a 162 game season. You may not have the popularity of a Sunday by Sunday NFL window, but even, that's double the games even the NBA has. And that in itself is an interesting proposition given the amount of things you can sell from an ad inventory perspective or just a programming perspective. What do you think it would mean if something like this became available at a time when I'm sure industry executives were keeping an eye on this, someone at an Amazon or something like that. But if it does become available, how interesting of a proposition is that for people in the market space if they weren't expecting this to be available?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we did kind of think that this was it now for a while. We're going to put our feet up. And in the course of a couple of weeks, we've heard Roger Goodell talk about their opt-out clauses with their major contracts. And now we're hearing it with the MLB and ESPN. And the question even coming up is they both have opt-outs. So who would opt out first? And why would they do it in the first place? So a lot of question marks there. And MLB's journey over the last couple of years has been pretty tumultuous with how this is all played out. So I think if MLB was to try and pull that trigger, it would be because they would know, they would be hearing there is genuine appetite from another major player or players in taking a good chunk of those rights and paying a heftier premium for it, because there's nothing else out there for them to plant their flag in the ground. You could think, obviously with Amazon's major investment in the NBA, that would be a likely partner now, if they have now shown that they're going to expand their investments outside of the NFL's Thursday Night Football package. Apple has dabbled. They have that one game a week, I think they were playing.
It's like Friday nights or something.
Yeah, which is just a bit puzzling. I don't know what they were trying to. Again, a bit more of the sort of the Netflix light approach, I suppose, of let's try an event-based initiative and see if that can generate us any real interest. But I don't think there's no way that has moved the needle for them in some sort of meaningful way. So it feels like Apple either could consider that and then go all in on being the home of the MLB and MLS, which makes that platform a lot more substantive than it is today. But I think there'll be a lot of interest. It's one of these rights that aren't at the top of the food chain, but actually now, given everything going on, given the breadth of content that you've talked about, the 160-odd games is just an insane number. I'd actually love to go back in the history books and understand how do we get to a point where you know what, we need 160 games a year before we get into the playoffs and going into that like that. Just blows me away. But anyway, I'd love to know if anyone knows about that. I would love to hear the story or knows where I can find out. I'll probably just ask ChatGPT probably. But we know that live still is the golden type of content, and they can provide that in spades. So no question that you could see someone come up with a sneaky big offer to pick up those rights if they're made available again.
I think the other thing for baseball, and you and I both said we're not experts on this particular topic. I think where baseball probably struggles a little bit more than the other sports is its reliance on regional sports networks. Most games are covered there, and we have been following, the regional sports network space. We've had people come on to talk about it, and they're filing for bankruptcy, being acquired by other media businesses. It is a bit all over the place. Like, I think franchises in Major League Baseball are more reliant on RSN deals than any other professional sports league in the U.S. And I think that situation, granted, ESPN will just be one of several media deals they have, but I at least know anecdotally, like my friends all have YouTube TV, they can't get access to the Cincinnati Reds without paying a further subscription because of the way the current RSN deal is. So I do think there's a bit where the Major League Baseball is in a bit of a unique position to the NFL, where every game's pretty much free to air except for Thursday Night Football, some things like that. And the NBA's got enough stuff on TNT and other markets that, yes, there's a lot of stuff on RSNs, but they're not as reliant on it as Major League Baseball is.
Yeah, and that's why the concept of Amazon making a play here would be really interesting, because they have been rumored a number of times of getting into the RSN game with different stories. They actually have an investment in is it the MSG networks? I think it might be the other New York one. It might be the MSG networks. They actually made a move for Diamond Sports Group, and I think that actually fell through in the end. But they have made several steps into the RSN world, and it would make sense to double down on that because of the locality, the value it's providing to consumers and customers in those markets is super significant for those that are fans of it, and will be incredibly sticky as a proposition if they can wrap it into something else bigger like what Amazon does. So I think Amazon makes a lot of sense for that very reason.
So switching over to Europe, finally talking some football, soccer, round ball, and I would say a significant move in the sense of it is ending a significantly long relationship, but UEFA, the founders, creators of the Champions League, they run the UEFA Euros and all of that, are switching to a new global commercial rights agency to help grow the sport. They have for decades been working with Switzerland-based Team Marketing, who've essentially helped them grow that product for as long as it has, and they're now moving over to Relevant Sports moving forward for their competitions from 2027 to 2033. Now, Nick, obviously it's interesting because it's almost like, FIFA and EA ending their relationship. When you have these sorts of partnerships that go on for so long, you're sort of like, what's the thing that finally brought this to an end? And I suppose the other part that's interesting for me as well is I didn't really know about Relevant. I probably should have, but I went in some Googling, and basically it says pretty clear at the front of their homepage, we are here to help drive the growth of soccer in the US. And there's been all these sorts of rumors, the NFL is playing abroad. We've had friendlies over in the US in the preseason tours, but there's been a lot of resistance to have a Premier League game in the US, but why couldn't you have a Champions League game in the US? And it just feels like the move to Relevant, given what it says on their homepage, and me just doing some very simple, analyzation, it feels like that's what this is moving towards.
Yeah, there's definitely a couple of interesting things here, I think, for the industry to pay a lot of attention to. One is just the move away from Team is such an interesting one because of the fact that basically Team was founded out of UEFA to build this commercial entity to run fairly standalone to them. And that was actually one of the first, that's probably the first instance we saw of that extraction of commercial rights and brought into an agency or a commercial sort of offering, an operation. And now you see that quite regularly in terms of major sports federations creating a commercial division that they keep hold of, but it's still that separation from the main business, I think, was a really interesting part of that. And ultimately, everyone's looking for the new edge, the new home run swing. And Team has been a super successful agency in what they've done for the UEFA Champions League over the years. Well run. I think Simon Crouch is the CEO currently. We actually did a podcast. I think I did one with Steve. Maybe you weren't there for that. And where we talked about the history of the Champions League. And we talked quite a lot about team marketing in that one. So it's worth giving that one a listen to hear a little bit about that. But they've been really successful. And it just feels now, though, that any sports probably is looking for that next big edge. And I think UEFA's hoping that Relevant gives them the innovation and the injection of new life that maybe takes them in a different direction and keeps the growth going in the way they want to. And they've been very successful at selling the rights in the US for the Champions League and have generated a huge amount of revenue off the back of that, despite what many, I think, thought before going into that is they weren't really sure what Relevant was going to bring to the table and how they were going to do what they've done with it to drive such immediate value. And actually, Relevant's initial roots, at least as I remember them, was off I think it was called the International Champions Cup. And that was basically the very first stages of those exhibition mini tournaments where a couple of major pro teams would go somewhere and they have a couple of days tournament against each other, which was an exhibition set of matches. And they've done that in New York, and I think they've done that in the UK a few times. And now that concept's moved around a lot across Asia. And they were kind of the founders of that approach, which you could imagine back in the day would have taken such a huge commitment and investment to get Arsenal and Man United and these other clubs to commit to bring their teams over at a certain time to play in this kind of round robin style exhibition tournament. But that proved to be really successful. They were bringing huge crowds to these exhibition matches in the US initially. And that was probably one of the starting points of really this accelerated fandom that has come alongside what NBC's done with the Premier League into European soccer. So they have played a really key role. For some people, they might be quite new kids on the block, but actually they have been doing this for quite some time. So you do have to wonder, to your point, are they going to make some major, bigger move where the Champions League final could be in the US and there's a huge cash cow for them? Like that has to be on the cards.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. I know people will hate it. How are you going to have a European champion final in the US? But I'd imagine just from following it that the Champions League final is pretty much like the Super Bowl. It's not actually for the fans. Yes, some fans will get in, but it is corporate hospitality, paying off the right people sort of thing that I appreciate. You won't like it, but it doesn't seem like neither of those games, Super Bowl just being the most apples for apples thing. It's not for the fans. Like, I'm sorry to say it. Like, it is about paying off all your sponsors, your brand partnerships, and things like that.
I mean, it's the Super Bowl, yeah, is not really for the fans, and it's an event. It's an event experience. It is almost disconnected somehow from the football in some way. I don't really know how to describe it, but I definitely agree with you. That is probably what they aspire for. They have tried a few things over the years to do a European version of that.
The halftime shows.
Yeah, and it has not hit well. But that's because they're trying to drop immediately like a US approach into Europe, almost without telling anyone. They're just like, oh, here you go. You should love this because the Americans do it. Well, I remember having countless meetings over the years with American executives. I remember once having it with quite a major hospitality business. And they said to me they were going to transform the way football was watched and consumed in UK stadiums and venues. And they're going to bring that American feel to them. And guess what? Didn't work. They tried to change. You can't just reset a culture overnight. You need time to build it up and get it to the place they want to get to. So maybe the injection of that pace of change is take it to the US, do the US thing there, let people, everyone can see that that's what you're doing, and then bring it back. That's super controversial and would, to your point, would not make many people happy. But I could see something like that being a bit of a spark for them, particularly if they can get some really good coverage and free-to-air deals in the US to sort of bankroll that type of approach and type of initiative, because there's clearly an audience there for them.
Yeah, and I don't know how much you followed on social media, Nick, but I would say one thing the Champions League has gotten right. I don't know if you follow what CBS Sports have been doing on their Champions League coverage, but it seems like Thierry Henry, Micah Richards, Jamie Gallagher, they've got a very similar vibe to what you get with, Charles Barkley and Shaq on NBA TNT Live. Like the coverage they get there. And like the funny thing is I see English fans being like, I would love for English sports commentators to behave like this instead of just the traditional sports media that we get. So it does seem like whether the Americans are enjoying as much as the Europeans are enjoying the American coverage of it, they have seemed to strike gold with that CBS deal. And we talked about it because our first event in the U.S. was in Atlanta when Turner Sports had just lost the rights to that, and CBS had bought them. And that was sort of the question, what was going to happen with that? But it does seem like, I've not looked at the numbers, but just totally anecdotally from the feedback I get on my social media feeds, they've at least built a community out of that with that Champions League show that they do.
Oh, it is incredible. I keep getting served all different clips from that for some time. My question around that is, how do you maximize the value of that? To your point, like you've got such a great platform, great mix of talent coming together. It's well followed globally. How do you bring that to life to get the maximum value out of it? Because even if you are generating huge numbers on social media, in this day and age, it's still not enough yet to turn it into direct returns in revenue. So can they drive audiences in a different way using the talent approach alongside the live matches? Could well be. But anyway, look, I think back to the whole sort of point here, the relevant sort of arrival or taking over of this relationship is massive. It is quite disruptive for the European sports landscape. Team is seen as one of the incumbents, the bedrocks of the sort of industry world. If we've talked about Sportel on this podcast, they are well known for their approaches behind closed doors, doing all sorts of incredible deals for the Champions League. So it can be interesting to see how Relevant really takes a different approach around the industry, because they have such a much more meatier, let's call it, piece of work to do now, which is selling these rights to some people that have been partners with team for such a long time. And obviously the interesting part of it is Relevant's owned by Stephen Ross, who is also the owner of the Miami Dolphins and a few other interesting businesses as well. And is probably has a mixed bag of reviews, I think, from what I've read over time.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, he may have some penalties and fines coming his way, but it is what it is.
So it's just gonna be super interesting to see how I guess this sounds a bit cliche, but like how much Americanism they bring to the approach, because I think the way that team marketing were run, the way that UEFA was run really well and really successful. But will this type lead to some sort of disruption that works for the better or the worse?
Look at you, Nick. Just the transitions are just flowing when you talk about the word disruption. Sort of the last thing that we are going to talk about, it's a little bit more of just you and I giving some subjective opinions because there's not a ton of facts on it. But speaking about disruption, is we got some smoke that there might be a new rival basketball league. Part of that coming from funding in the Middle East. Part of it, interestingly, coming from Mav Carter. Those that don't know Mav Carter, that is LeBron James's right-hand man. So this isn't just, some people floating things out there. This is a man very closely connected to probably arguably the most powerful man in basketball at the moment, about setting up a new league to compete with the NBA. And it would be a global one. If I understand it, Nick, it'd be events based. They'd have different locations that they would move it around to. Lots of money potentially being proposed to be injected into it. And obviously, Nick, it's very early days. We don't know a ton about it, but I guess my initial feel is it'd be very naive to say it doesn't have a chance, given we've seen Live Golf, disrupt the PGA Tour. We're seeing all different kinds of leagues popping up from left and right, that I think it'd be wrong to just dismiss it as an idea given the amount of money and the amount of potential influence. The execution we might have to argue on, but the idea that it won't come, I don't know, it feels naive to just dismiss it.
It feels naive to dismiss to some extent, but there's lots of ideas flying around the industry. I just got sent something last night that is actually happening that I can't talk about, but all I'll say is there's some similarities in this type of location-based global offering where they're trying to maximize the international stardom, the fan base that things like basketball have. I do think it would be nearly impossible. My view on this is that to come in and disrupt someone like the NBA, there's a few layers to it. And I could probably spend a lot of time talking about this because I think it just has like a bigger question to it about anyone trying to disrupt an incumbent in this industry, but particularly of this nature. Firstly, they're going to need a lot of money. They're going to need a lot of money. They're going to need the big stars. They're going to need the LeBrons or alike to really, if they want to solidify this and put this on the map, that's going to cost a huge amount of money. There's speculation that this is one of these concepts that they might try and have in the off season. But if they have that in the off season, that means there is no off season. The seasons are already grueling, 82 games plus playoffs. And if they can't get the stars, where will they go? Will they go to the second tier, third tier players, or will they go with the vets? You start seeing Carmelo Anthony and Dwayne Wade and that coming out of retirement to play in this 3-on-3 style competition or whatever to basically ride the wave of their fandom and follower bases into driving this new global proposition. I just think there's so many holes in it. And you think, but one of the things that the NBA does really well is they really are able to build the legacy of a player. They constantly are talking about who's the best at all-time best at this. You could be assists, rebounds, all these different statistical things, not just the GOAT debate between Jordan and James, but way more than that. And they make sure they're part of the ecosystem so effectively. To step away from that to the surety of the endorsement deals, the media visibility, etc., that the NBA and the US market gives alone to try and do something that's global, it comes with all sorts of question marks on the type of person that would be truly willing to step into that void and take on this approach. So I think it's a cool idea. I think it would be really difficult, however, to get off the ground. But the speculation is there's Saudi money, there's Singaporean money from governments coming into this kind of concept because they love the idea so much. These players, if you think about outside of football, it's a team sport, but it's only five-a-side, and it's very star-based. They are true stars in a lot of major Asian markets as well. So there is a huge fan base for them to tap into. I just don't know how they get this off the ground and drive the returns they really need and attract the talent they need to really make it a success from day one. And they always talk about equity, but I don't. What does that really mean in this day and age? I don't really know if they can guarantee that at scale. Is that only for the first wave of players, and the rest of everyone else after that doesn't get a piece of the pie? Yeah, plenty of question marks still remain.
It definitely feels opportunistic in the sense of, for the first time, I think you could say in the NBA's history, you could make the argument the top 5 players are all international players from Europe. I don't think it's a stretch of, Luka, Joker, Giannis. Like, you could start going through and saying like some of the best players. I forgot Wemby. I know he's not the top 5 yet, but he might be top 5 discussed. It seems opportunistic in the sense of you probably couldn't drive this, because I do think to a degree you would struggle to get the Americans, but could you get someone like Luka, someone like Wemby that have a more international profile already to commit to this in a way that someone that's more American-based wouldn't? So it feels opportunistic in the sense of you might be able to pull on some strings that you couldn't pull on before. And I think the other issue is, we just talked about Champions League. This isn't like Champions League in the sense of it's a season within a existing season. To your point, it's meant to be in the off season. So it's not even something that complements the existing basketball structure. It's something totally external, which, I don't know what the execution is. It just feels opportunistic.
It feels very opportunistic. And then you wrap that into the NBA apparently looking at launching something in Europe when you've got the EuroLeague established. And you just start to say, well, where's the talent going to start ending up? Is it going to start being split up between different leagues a little bit? Because if you think about it, let's say this European league kicks off, or the Europe League had a little bit more money, or they could kick off this global league. You might get a situation where the next Doncic, the next Jokic doesn't get found, because they wouldn't have the appetite to go to America like many others would. If the competition isn't as clearly set as the industry standard, they would be happy probably being closer to home. So I don't know. I just think fragmentation is always a risky thing for fandom, and whether that would be a healthy outcome for basketball. But there is plenty of this going on because everyone wants a piece of the sports pie. And the NBA seems to be as inclusive. They've included private equity investment. They've done all these things to try and open up a little bit of the door to more contributors and more stakeholders. But there's always someone trying to take a piece of that market. And I can't see this getting off the ground easily. But if the check's big enough, there's enough money coming in from somewhere, everything's on the table.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Nick, that was a very news-filled podcast from us today. I'm going to have to go rest my voice.
Yeah, I'm a bit raspy after that as well, I have to say. But and also it was quite American-centric, but there was a lot going on with America and the global side. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. So good that we could get our teeth into that. But yeah, I think I need to drink some water after this. It's been a good chat, but a tiring one.
You and me both. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this week, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks, everyone. Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review, and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsProNick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Streamtimers. Until next time.